a very happy new year. I think this is the first podcast of the new year. So greetings to one and all. And tonight I am honoured and privileged to have on as my guest my good friend, Bruce Halliday. Good evening, Bruce.
Hi, David.
Great to see you. Great to see you, Bruce. Bruce is someone I've been asking to come on the show for some weeks, and I've finally been able to persuade him. So I'm really, really pleased tonight, and I know that you'll be really interested in what Bruce has to say, because in time-honoured fashion, I always start off these podcasts by asking my guests just to give a brief introduction, tell the viewers who you are and what you're all about, and just a brief précis of Bruce Halliday, please, if you could, Bruce.
Indeed. Well, I'm Bruce Halliday. I live in Dumfries in the southwest of Scotland. I was a GP for 30 years. I retired from my practice in April. So I've been having a wee bit of time off in the last few months. I've just started doing a bit of out-of-hours work locally at Dumfries and Galloway just recently. So that's me. And I met David through All for Unity, if we go on to mention that. So we stood together in the Scottish Parliament election in May. Unfortunately, didn't get elected, but we did our best. So yeah, that's. I'll stop there, David, and let you ask anything else.
Fantastic. So as you can see, everyone, we have a genuine specialist tonight, someone who has a great deal of knowledge of an area which has been sorely neglected and dreadfully mismanaged under the NHS, and that is healthcare. So we're gonna spend a lot of tonight talking about healthcare in Scotland, and I'm very keen to get Bruce's views on the way it's being managed right now and what he feels. And believe me, he has some real insight here, so it's going to be very well worthwhile, everyone. Just so the obvious question that leads on from that, Bruce is right that he and I both stood as candidates for All for Unity, or Alliance for Unity as it was previously known. The reason I keep saying the two names, just in case you're not clear, is it was originally called Alliance for Unity, but the Electoral Commission is very, very nervous about allowing anyone to call themselves an alliance, to have the word alliance in their name. Consequently, very, very late on in the day, we were forced to change the name of the party, which was really an enormous setback for us. But we rode it out, and we changed the name to All for Unity. So we still call ourselves both now and again, but it is what it is. It's the same thing. Anyway, Bruce, so the obvious question that leading on from your intro is, what made you get involved in politics? What was it? Was it a particular thing? Was it a succession of things that said to you, I've got to stand up here?
Yeah, good question. I mean, the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, it's fair to say, I think I didn't really engage fully with that until about 3 weeks to go, when it became apparent that there was a risk of separating from the rest of the United Kingdom. And I was aghast at that. I couldn't believe that we were getting close to doing that. At which point I did that most British of thing and started banging in letters to the newspapers, as you do. And then when I came up to, I was always planning to retire in April, and I was aware that was just before the Scottish Parliament election. So initially I thought, well, I can retire in April and I can maybe get involved with a bit of canvassing locally for the election. And then, as you do, I'd always sort of thought, well, if I hadn't been a GP, is there something else that I maybe would have thought of doing? And I have to say, I think actually maybe politics would have been okay, and get involved with that. And then I heard George Galloway's first two broadcasts for the Alliance for Unity, as it was at that point, and found myself agreeing with every single word that George said about the SNP and about the threat of separation. At which point I thought, well, you only live once, so why don't I just go the full Monty here and stand for the Parliament, which is what I did. Got in touch with George and Jamie and took it on from there. So I was a bit surprised to find myself in an election, I have to admit, but it was good fun.
It was exceedingly good fun. I can't remember if I've told the guys this or not, but I had a broadly similar journey, not from medicine. I worked in information technology for many, many years, and I pretty much fully retired just about the time that I moved back up north, which was a year ago. And same reason, really, it just fitted in terms of the time. Politics has been a big interest of mine, had been a big interest since teenage years. I mean, I can remember my first introduction into politics was in 1970, the 1970 election, general election, because I'm older than Bruce, I'm sure. And I went to bed quite
almost before my time.
Exactly. So I went to bed all excited about, who's going to win the election. Is it going to be Harold Wilson or Edward Heath? And I knew them as the Labour leader and the Tory leader. And I woke up in the morning, ran downstairs, said to my dad, who won the election? And he said, the Conservatives romped it. And I thought, who are the Conservatives? I've never heard of them. I didn't even know what the Conservative Party was. So that's how little I knew. And I realised then, I was only a kid, but I realised then I had a lot to learn. So I soon got into it. But much like you, Bruce, I always thought, I'm going to do something else in retirement. I can remember thinking when I was younger, what on earth am I going to do in my 50s? I can't do this stuff in my 50s. There'll be people coming out of school who are more knowledgeable than I am. And of course, that's exactly what's happened with the world of IT. So I'm glad I got out when I did. My son now knows and has forgotten 20 times more than I'll ever know about IT. And I did it for a living. So, yeah, we both got involved belatedly. And we are both still involved to an extent, in as much as we still take part in discussions, Bruce and I, and I've talked about the guys at the Majority, which is like an online media organisation in Scotland, who were massively helpful to All for Unity and to the Unionist cause in the last year's election. And I'm still very much involved with helping to shape what they're going to be doing going forward. I guest appear on one of their podcasts on a Thursday night, and we're going to be having a lot more meetings. I referred to one before Christmas, and I'm hoping Bruce will join us in that, because I think what will happen is a lot of the guys who stood up for the first time and joined in with All for Unity and stood for election, I'm not sure very many of them will stand again. But I know that a lot of them will want to retain an involvement maybe in the background, and most of them, well, not most of them, but most of the people have indicated that they wouldn't like to stand again, have certainly said, yes, I'd be very interested in doing some background work. So is that something you think you might do also, Bruce, ongoing?
Yes, quite probably, David. Yeah, I think so. I mean, there was obviously discussion about where All for Unity went for the future, and,
yes.
Becoming a sort of pressure group, if you like, was one of the options there.
Yeah.
And I think realistically that was probably the best option for us as a party, given what happened in the election.
Absolutely. And I talk about this a lot, and I forgive me, listeners, viewers, but it's very important that we learn the lesson from last year. I mean, I'm not just on here with my ex-colleagues playing it off all our yesterdays. It's not that at all. I'm involved with numerous groups, and we discuss, how we're going to approach the upcoming May election. And I feel it massively important that we learn the lessons of last year. And all of the pro-UK parties have to. We look at the way that the Conservatives approached that election, which was pretty much devil take the hindmost. We're going for both votes. So if you want to stop the SNP, give both votes to the Conservative Party. And they fought like rats in a sack on that basis. And it was really quite disgraceful, because as a result, a figure I've quoted many times, make no apology for quoting it again, as a result of that strategy, 1,170,000 pro-UK constituency votes were lost. You might as well not have bothered voting. 1,170,000, and there were only like 2 million odd votes cast. So absolutely disgraceful. The Labour Party, well, as usual, they couldn't make their minds up what they wanted. They had some candidates who were acquiescent on independence, which is just unbelievable. And the Liberal Democrats, of course, just thought they were still fighting the Brexit campaign. So ridiculous. And of course, with All for Unity, what we found, and Bruce referred to it there, we are going to be a pressure group ongoing. We will not be standing candidates under the auspices of All for Unity, certainly not in the local elections in May, simply because it would probably split the vote. And that was an accusation that was levelled at us very often. I refuted it last year because of the machinations of the Holyrood election, in as much as if you are a list-only party and you don't field candidates in constituencies, you are literally twice, almost, or 3 or even 4 times as likely to have one of your candidates successfully elected on the list than the parties who stand candidates and, crucially, who win seats in that region. And that's just a fact. That fact does not carry over to the single transferable vote system in the council election. So there seems very little point in All for Unity standing in May. That doesn't mean we wouldn't consider standing in the next Holyrood election, or possibly even in the next general election. I don't believe that decision has been made, but I would say at the moment it's probably unlikely. But all that being said, it probably is the time for a new party in Scotland, because we see every day more and more people saying, hang on, the opposition parties really aren't doing the job here. Now, and so this is why I keep raising this, because it's vital that we don't make the same mistakes as we did last year, when, as we remember, over 50% of votes cast in the Holyrood election went to pro-UK parties. 49.9% of votes cast went to the SNP in the constituencies, yet with that 49.9%, they won 85% of the seats. And if we do what we did in May, and if we carry on with the main pro-UK parties doing as they're doing right now, then that pattern will be repeated in May, I guarantee it. And if they take that same modus operandi into the next Holyrood election, then the same thing will happen then. And it will be even worse, of course, then, because as we know, the Greens, the SNP's bag carriers, who are not green at all in the traditional sense, they are in fact nationalists. We know they're nationalists. They are, if you like, playing the system by purporting to be a different party when they're in fact SNP to the core. That's what they are. They're nationalists. That will be even worse then, because you can be sure that the SNP won't repeat the mistake they made in May, which was to field a full range of candidates on the list. They took over 1 million votes and they won 2 seats, because that's the way the Scottish election works. They are not going to waste those 1 million votes again. It is not worth the SNP getting 500,000 votes per seat. That's just not going to happen. They will allow the Greens a clear run to mop up the list seats. That's what's going to happen. I will stake my reputation on it. I've been watching elections, as I say, for over 50 years. That's what's going to happen. So all this talk that you hear right now of, oh, at least we stopped an SNP majority, absolute rubbish. We did not stop an SNP majority. The fact that 8 of the Green MPs wear a different coloured rosette means nothing. There are 64 SNP MSPs, whereas before last May's election there were 63, and there are 8 Green MSPs, whereas before last May's election there were 6. So that's a net gain of 3. That means there are 72 out of the 129 seats are voting every time for whatever the SNP raises. We do not have a functioning opposition in Scotland. We certainly do not have a minority administration, because a minority administration is one where the ruling party has fewer seats than the opposition parties combined. The Green Party is not an opposition party, and it's very important that people understand this. This phrase, at least we stopped a majority, is a Conservative Party soundbite, which means nothing. Nothing. If you don't believe me, we'll answer this. 64 SNP MSPs and 8 Green MSPs are currently in the chamber. How different would it be if there were 68 SNP MSPs and 4 Green MSPs? The answer is not. It's not in the slightest, because the voting pattern would be exactly the same. So we've really got to get away from this idea that we somehow succeeded in May in stopping a majority. We didn't. We failed. We failed abjectly and utterly. We failed because we got more votes than the nationalists, but we got way fewer seats. Not good enough. Not even close to being good enough. So we cannot sleepwalk into making the same mistake again. And that's why I go back to the days when we were doing what we were doing, and we search inwardly all the time to see, what did we do wrong? What did we do wrong? And as Bruce alluded to, something to which he alluded there, we're not going to be standing for election this time round, as we've said. We will, however, be a pressure group, and that is, if you like, a mechanism which we will use to try to encourage the main parties to do the right thing and to work in tandem, rather than relying on traditional party foibles of we're the Conservatives rather, and we're not going to stand alongside Labour, and the vice versa, whereas Labour saying, oh, we're not going to be red Tories, we made that mistake in the Better Together campaign, never again. And ridiculously, at times they stand in councils with the SNP to keep the Conservatives out. Scotland has moved on, guys, and it's essential that people understand this, particularly the main pro-UK parties. And that's why I keep raising this, guys. And that's just something, Bruce, you won't have heard any of these podcasts before, I don't imagine, but this is something I come back to again and again. We've got to do it right this time. The council elections, who knows what's going to happen? We will be doing what we can. We'll be encouraging voters to vote the right way to keep SNP and Green councillors out, and to make sure that as many councils as possible are in under the control of the main pro-UK parties. But the main pro-UK parties have a lot of work to do here if they're going to retain the faith of the electorate, because a lot of people are watching and are aghast at what they're seeing. Today, for example, Nicola Sturgeon today announced the lifting of restrictions on people going to outdoor events and hospitality. And Douglas Ross praised the Scottish Government for its handling of the lockdown measures. And I'm just thinking, my God, what are you doing? You're in opposition. Why are you doing this? And at the same time, he's distancing himself more and more further every day from Boris Johnson. Well, that might go down magnificently with focus groups, but let me tell you, that is not going to get any traction with the electorate, Douglas. You're making a big mistake. Anna Sarwar's party is riven with talk of whether or not their candidates may be pro-independence. I mean, you've got a pro-UK, a UK party with candidates potentially who are pro-independence. If Scotland ever became independent, Labour would never win another general election again in the UK, or what's left of it. So, crazy. This is why we have got to do what we've got to do, and I'm sure Bruce will attest. There is an awful lot of crazy, muddled up thinking among supporters of these main parties and within the main parties, and we're really not seeing much evidence that they've got their acts together to an extent that they could make significant inroads into the SNP and Greens in May, and I'm very concerned. What's your feeling about that, Bruce, in terms of what you see happening and what you think is likely to happen in May?
Well, I don't know. I mean, as far as May goes, certainly as far as the 2026 election goes, I mean, you can already see it will be a rerun of what just happened there. Just in May. And the main question will be, will the Liberal Democrats go down to 3 MSPs rather than 4? And, how many seats are the parties going to contest where they've got absolutely no chance of winning, but by standing, they gift it to the SNP.
Absolutely.
And particularly look at the Liberal Democrats. I mean, I wish they'd kind of go away, to be quite honest, because the number of seats where they win maybe 2,000 votes, and then the SNP win the seat with a majority of 1,000 or 1,500.
You're right.
It's maddening, really.
It is maddening.
I don't see there's any great evidence that they're going to do anything different. I've got a horrible feeling come 2026, it will be the same again.
Well, this is my concern also. If we carry on with the same thinking that went into the election of May, and some of the thinking among commentators was, honestly, it almost defied belief. Maddening, frustrating. Those are the adjectives, or those are the terms I would use to describe exactly what was happening in terms of particularly the mainstream media. Stephen Daisley, in the lead up to the May election, 2 or 3 times a week he was regurgitating the same article, beseeching, pleading with Conservative and pro-UK voters not to vote for George Galloway because he doesn't like George Galloway. It was just unbelievable. And then you had a gentleman called Henry Hill, as another Conservative commentator, saying, what we need in Scotland is a cocktail of pro-UK options so that voters can choose. A cocktail of pro-UK options when you've got a party who are guaranteed over 45% of the vote standing on a single issue, and he wants a range of options. So how can these people function during the day if that's what they think? I mean, this is insane. These people are paid commentators to talk about the political situation, and they're coming up with utter rubbish like that. Crazy. So you're quite right. Things have got to change. They've got to change, because we cannot allow Scotland to be railroaded into a very, very dangerous situation. And we are in a dangerous situation now, because you've got Sturgeon saying stubbornly, oh yes, I'm going to do everything I can to have a referendum next year. A referendum next year. We're still in the middle of a pandemic. We're not out of it yet at all. We've just had Scotland closed down for another 2 weeks, effectively. And now 3 weeks, in fact, I think it was from Boxing Day, yeah. And now she's saying, oh yeah, next year, yeah, it's a good time to have a referendum. So Scotland's going to be independent if they get the referendum and win it next year. What are they going to do with paying back furlough, for example? It's just insane. It is absolutely insane. So what's happening, of course, is they're spoiling for a referendum, the SNP. The Conservative UK government is saying you're not getting one. And so the possible damage to the constitution, the fabric of the UK, is there. It could get worse and worse because they could just spin this as England are denying us our democratic right and all this nonsense. They're talking about taking it to court so it can be discussed in the Supreme Court whether or not the Scottish Parliament has the right to call a referendum. Now, God knows what's going to happen in the Scottish courts because the judiciary is in the SNP government's pocket, as we know. So very worrying times. So if the Conservative government in Westminster think they can just say, no, nah, that's not going to cut it, guys. You're going to have to do something a little bit more fundamental than that. You cannot do that because there's nothing the SNP like more than grievance. And there's nothing that their supporters like more than thinking, Tories, they're stopping us. In Westminster, when they really mean England, we this resentment that they feel, and it's very dangerous times for the Constitution. Could not be more dangerous. This is the worst scenario of all. Is this idea of having a very unpopular but handsome majority Conservative government in Westminster with a very strong majority SNP legislature in Edinburgh. Very, very bad for this country because it's almost as if the two forces are pulling further apart. And there's no question, or there's no visible evidence of any softening on either side, really. And while it's great that the UK government are saying, no, you're not getting a referendum, that's terrific. But you can't just say, no, next question. You've got to do something a little bit more fundamental than that. You've got to say, okay, we're not going to give you a referendum. The reason is blah, blah, blah. And this is what we would suggest you do if you really are serious about this. And that forms the basis of something Alliance for Unity, All for Unity stood for. And that was a Clarity Act. And I'm going to have somebody on the show soon from Canada. And it's Canada that we're basing our if you like, our aims. Because in Canada, Quebec sought to become independent back in, I think it was the 70s. They had a referendum where the vote went 50.1 to 49.9 in favour of staying. It couldn't have been closer. And of course, they thought, oh, we'll have a second one, we'll get it this time. Second one was actually a wider margin of victory for the Remain side, for the staying together side. Since then, the Canadian government has had the foresight to enact a Clarity Act. And this Clarity Act says, in the event that you want to stand and try to secede from Canada, these are the conditions you must meet, and they laid them all out. Now, we, mainly Jamie Blackett, party leader, and I, the Constitution spokesperson, did the same thing last year. We drew up what we believed should be the terms of a Clarity Act. I spoke to the chairman of the 1922 committee, said this is what I would suggest you do. I know that Jamie and George both spoke to very senior figures in the Conservative Party and in the government, and I'm very much hoping that they're going to do something here, because I would be worried about frankly, I'm worried about Boris Johnson's capability to outsmart Nicola Sturgeon anyway on this particular issue. So it's very difficult for the UK Prime Minister to understand, to read the room in Scotland, if you like, because Scotland's always thought a little bit differently from England politically. That's the case. That is certainly for the last 60 years. So it's very dangerous to do this. And so it's essential that they do something a little bit more concrete, a little bit more, tangible. And when it comes to stopping any suggestion of a referendum. So worrying times. So we spent pretty much the first half of the show talking about what we've done in the past and what we've been doing. But what I want to get on to, because Bruce is here as an expert on a particular matter, and I want to come on to the health service in Scotland. Bruce, one thing I remember when you and I, we had a kind of chat like this very early on in the All for Unity campaign, and you told me about your observations of the health service in Scotland in terms of being able to, or even one step below that, if you like, the education system in Scotland in terms of university places for students from Scotland. And I remember you saying that there is a great deal of difficulty being experienced by Scottish based school pupils gaining entry to universities in Scotland. Could you just tell our viewers about that, please, Bruce?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the case. It's, you know, as a GP practice, we would have local youngsters come to the surgery, have a look around and see what GPs do, and then in their application they could say they'd done that, which was all very good. And these were all incredibly bright youngsters, desperate to be doctors, you know, and they've got their 5 A's, and they've gone off and they've done time in nursing homes and all the rest of it to show they're interested, and they apply to get in and they don't get in. And yet, you know, here we are, we have a great lack of GPs. The BMA did a survey just recently, and I think 28% of GP practices in Scotland have got a GP vacancy. So, you know, they've got a spare place, they need a GP and they can't get one. And similarly in the hospitals, there are consultant vacancies. When we were in May doing the election, there was up to about 500 vacant consultant posts in Scotland. I mean, it's crazy. And as far as medical students go, there are about 900 medical students graduate every year from Scottish universities. So 900 medical students every year coming out as qualified doctors. You say, how on earth can you have a situation where you've got 900 medical students coming out, and yet we can't get GPs here and we can't get consultants here? And part of the reason for that is that research tends to show that it's medical students who are domiciled in Scotland who are more likely to want to end up staying here. Yeah. And the percentage of Scottish domiciled medical students actually dropped quite significantly over about 10 years. It started off about 63%, I think it was, and it had dropped to about 51% at one stage. And the SNP, they have belatedly started to address that a little bit, but you know, it's too little and it's too late. Yeah. And I just think they've been rampaging around the streets, waving saltires, shouting about separation, when they should have been paying attention to the health service and what we need to get a functioning health service here. So,
absolutely right. I mean, I find that a very disturbing scenario, and it highlights what we've always said. The public services in Scotland, be they health, education, transport, whatever, are being appallingly mismanaged, to the extent that, just to summarise what Bruce is saying there, you've got students in Scotland who are doing all this stuff, the right stuff, and doing all the extracurricular stuff to make their CVs look attractive. And they, even with all that and with the maximum possible grades, they cannot get into universities in Scotland. Now, there's a reason for that, and the main reason for that is, of course, because Nicola Sturgeon tells you that she's allowed free tuition fees in Scotland for Scottish domicile students, not for those from overseas, though, and certainly not for those from England. Now, if you're a university and you've got a certain number of people to let in every year, and that university has to wash its face financially, what do you think they're going to do, guys? They're going to admit people who pay fees rather than people admit students who pay nothing. And that's what's happening. But the impact on that on the Scottish Health Service for people studying medicine is absolutely disastrous, because these people are presumably then, Bruce, coming to Scotland, paying their way to get through, getting their qualification, and then going back home and getting a job there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's what happens. I mean, medical students at Scottish universities, there's always been students have come from elsewhere in the United Kingdom and from internationally, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, indeed.
But, you know, we do need to keep enough graduated medical students here to have our own health service function.
100%. Diversity has been a main strength of Scotland since my earliest memories. I think Scotland does that exceptionally well. I think people from overseas and from other corners of, say, the UK are assimilated into Scottish life far better and far more easily, I think, far more seamlessly than in some places like maybe south of England, for example. I've always been struck by that because I've spent a lot of time in the south of England. I spent a lot of time in Scotland, And I think I can say that's the case. But latterly, of course, you find that, English people are not quite as welcome in Scotland, and that's a very, very disturbing trend as well, of course. But I digress. That's just an observation. But this is why we say what we do, because one area of Scottish life education is completely messing up another area of Scottish life, healthcare, just because of the this drive to get more money in from students from overseas, and the impact. Imagine that a Scottish student going to a good school, being able to do whatever they can to make themselves look like an ideal candidate, and they can't get in through no fault of their own. That is Nicola Sturgeon's real legacy, and she's always said, "I should be judged in education." Well, okay, the jury's in, and you failed. Yeah, so that's where we are. So really, very, very disappointing, and an awful thing for people, for youngsters in Scotland today, trying to get ahead and trying to get on and to improve the quality of life for people. So, I mean, generally speaking, Bruce, just in general, or be as specific as you like, what are your thoughts on healthcare provision under the SNP? Did you see a deterioration in the health service in the last, say, 14 years since the SNP have been in? Or don't let me lead the witness. What are your views on how it is right now?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I came back. I'm from Dumfries originally, and I went off and then came back in 1998. And at the point that I returned here, the hospital was fully manned. There were consultants there that had been there for years. They were sort of in with the bricks, and it all ran very well. And now you have vacancies in the hospital, and it's a very good hospital, good staff, and all the rest of it. But there are vacancies there. So, it's been really quite a big change, actually, and a deterioration. And as far as GP surgeries goes, there are a number of practices locally that have now got taken over by the health board. And that's happened because they've lost GPs, they've not been able to replace them. And they end up with the health board taking the practice on to run it. And that usually means that you've got to get locums in. Locums are expensive. You get a loss of continuity of care, and the whole thing kind of deteriorates, really. I was a trainee doctor, a trainee GP in Edinburgh, and I was amazed that there was a practice near where my practice was in Inverleith Row, had about 4,000 patients. It actually closed, completely gone. Vanished. And when I was a trainee, which would have been about 1992, I mean, even that such a thing could happen would have been just unthinkable. Nicola Sturgeon became the health secretary in Scotland in 2007. In 2008, the BMA warned that there would be GP shortages. And nevertheless, I think when 2021 came along, the College of GPs was predicting a shortfall of 856 GPs. It's a huge number. And this has all happened on the SNP watch, and Nicola Sturgeon was health secretary for a while. Yeah. It's all back at their door. And, I think the problem is really, and what I find a bit maddening with devolution was meant to bring decision-making closer to home, and Scotland, you get better decisions made, and good in theory, but the trouble is we've got the SNP in power, who I don't think really have got any notion of making devolution work. To some extent, it would be counterproductive if everything was rosy and running well. People would look at it and say, well, why should we change this? Yeah. So I think part of the problem is there's no great incentive for the SNP to make an effort and make things better, and you're seeing that in health. You're seeing it in education and all the rest of it. And it's to the detriment of us all living here.
You're absolutely singing my song here, Bruce, if you like. It is absolutely the case that the SNP does not want devolution to work. The SNP does not want Holyrood to function. That's absolutely true. Might seem a bizarre statement to make, but it's true, because if it was functioning, people would say, well, why do you want independence? Things are going so well now. So instead, it's as if I think it's partially they're not really caring about making Holyrood work, and I think there is also a great deal of ineptitude, because whether they wanted to or not, I don't think they're capable. You look at the the talent pool in the SNP, particularly in the cabinet and the front bench, utter mediocrity. I mean, Hamza Yousaf was the health secretary. Who's kidding who? Come on. He was the transport secretary at the time when he didn't even have his car insured. Then he was the justice secretary when he decided that it was essential that Scotland had an offensive behaviour at Football Act. I mean, it's like Monty Python's Ministry of Silly Walks. It's unbelievable. How can you have a legislation aimed at football fans? I mean, I still can't believe it happened. And luckily, even the meek and mild opposition MSPs in Holyrood eventually came together and said, you've got to get rid of this. And they did, thank God. But really, that's the SNP for you. So it's partially the fact that they don't really want it to be any better than it is, but partially the fact that they couldn't make it any better if they wanted to, which they don't. And so this is, in the meantime, I'm reminded of Neil Kinnock's famous speech in Bournemouth in 1985. You can't play politics with people's lives, with people's jobs, and with people's public services. And the SNP do that every single day. And let's not forget there is a human cost to this. It's not just about students not being able to get into university, regrettable though that is. It's about what happens as a result of that. You don't have enough doctors, you don't have enough nurses. Practices have to close down. We know that the provision for the care for the elderly in this country, in Scotland, is utterly appalling. We saw what happened during the early days of lockdown. Patients in hospitals who were positive for COVID were moved out of hospitals and into care homes, into the very environment where the virus would do most damage, i.e. among the elderly. Over 3,000 care home residents died directly as a result of that catastrophic SNP governmental policy decision. Utterly appalling. Someone should face a criminal trial for that. Utterly appalling. One thing I must also ask you about, Bruce, because it's been a very, very high profile, if you like, issue, is drug deaths in Scotland. Do you have any first-hand experience of how the treatment of people with drug issues has degenerated under the SNP? Because we know it has.
Yeah.
Is that something that came across your radar at all?
Well, I think any GP has people coming in with drug problems, and Dumfries, unfortunately, like many places, has got a drug. There are people taking drugs, and it is a problem. I would have to say, in all honesty, that in terms of referring people in, probably not a huge difference, to be honest, locally. But clearly, you look at the national figures, and I mean, they're shocking. I mean, I've got a graph here which probably wouldn't show up, but which shows I'll hold it up anyway.
Go on, yeah. Yep. Talk us through it.
Got it there. So that big red line at the top is Scotland's death rate in comparison to the rest of Europe. And I mean, it's so bad it looks like fake news. But unfortunately, it's not. It's real. And that's the drug deaths per capita. And we're way, way out in front of everyone else. And, I mean, I think England, Wales, Northern Ireland, they all sort of operate under the same kind of rules, if you like, as we do here. So there's something very badly wrong.
Absolutely. I can remember, I always remember this anecdote, and I'm sure I mentioned this to you in the past, Bruce. I had my cousin has a son who studied medicine in Edinburgh in, I think it was the early to mid-90s. And this was right at the time that, if you remember, the novel Train Spotting was huge at the time, and it told a story of young men in Leith who were addicted to heroin. And the talk was that Scotland, or Edinburgh, I think, was the heroin capital of Western Europe or something like this. Anyway, I was talking to him. He was from Northern Ireland. He was over for a rugby international. And I said to him, well, how are you getting on? And he told me about the work and everything. And I said, so it must be terrible you being in Edinburgh with as a medical guy with this massive heroin problem. And he just said, I'll be honest with you, the problem in Edinburgh and Scotland is not heroin. The problem in Scotland is alcohol. And I thought, wow. And would you say that's the case? I mean, I'm not in any way just as a societal issue. Is it? I'm guessing far more people abuse alcohol than abuse heroin. Is that still the case? Is there still a massive problem with people's lives and health being affected adversely by abusing alcohol? in
Oh, there
Scotland?
is, yeah. I mean, there is a problem there, and it probably affects an awful lot more people, alcohol than heroin. There are a significant number of people taking heroin, but there's a lot more people drinking excess alcohol. And it devastates lives, and it causes real problems both for the person and for their family.
Sure.
So no, it is a problem.
Still a problem massively. Yeah, well, you do see more drunks than junkies, I guess, and I don't mean that in any way in a derogatory sense. But well, I mean, again, it's yet another example of life societal issue under the SNP. I guess, in fairness to them, they have tried something to the SNP government, that is to try to make things better with alcohol, but it seems to be very clumsy measures they take, like, for example, dropping the drink driving rate, which I'm not sure has had any impact on either road deaths or conviction rates. And secondly, minimum unit pricing for alcohol, which we all know just forces people to get alcohol from outside Scotland. I mean, you get these stories of people going down to Carlisle to fill up and come back. And, I know nationalists say that's apocryphal, it doesn't happen, but I know it does happen. I've seen it happening. And when I lived in the south of England, in the days when you had duty-free, actual duty-free, you used to be able to go across to the north of France and stock up and bring back van loads of alcohol and cigarettes and stuff. And it definitely does happen. So, I mean, it strikes me that there isn't a great deal of intellectual capability going into some of the health policy decisions in Scotland. Would you agree with that? Do you think are you disappointed? Is that something that GPs feel? Would you say that they're not really being led very well?
Well, I think certainly when I was finding out about the health service before the election there, and speaking to people locally involved with the health board, and the comment there was just the lack of planning that they have, and it sounded as though they hadn't had any real detailed planning going on for quite a number of years, and again to the detriment of the whole service. And whatever the reason for that, whether they just don't want to bring in any measures that might make them less popular and have less people voting for the SNP.
Exactly.
But that was, I was quite struck by that. It was just a real lack of planning involved, and you've got to sort of plan your service and think, right, where are we going? What do we need to do now? And what are the new issues? It sounded as though that just wasn't happening.
Very disappointing indeed. And talking of lack of planning and poor decisions, we have to talk about lockdown. So clearly that's an issue with the health service right at the centre. What are your views on the way lockdown has been handled, and what do you feel about the measures which have been announced today by way of lifting of some restrictions? Any thoughts on that at all?
Well, I was pleased that pleased I can go to the Scotland-England rugby match and the Scotland-France rugby match as well. I would have been gutted if that had been called off. So it makes no sense really. And you've got these games going on down in England, and yet England's rates are probably marginally better than they are here. So they obviously don't really do an awful lot. Apart from depriving people of watching their sport and their football and their rugby, and improving their mental health and just getting them out socialising and meeting people. So I was pleased they lifted that one. I'm not sure I can resume my five-a-side football yet. I haven't quite worked out that one. I mean, you've got to pore through the minutiae of the details to see, right, can I get myself on a five-a-side football pitch now,
Good for you.
I suspect I can't, but
nah, probably not. Well, the main thing is that you don't dance with anybody, Bruce, because as we all know, that's the biggest evil.
No, definitely not.
Dear, so I mean, how do you feel? My view. Let me give you my view. There has been this sense that Sturgeon has to be seen to be doing something different to Boris Johnson, the dreaded, hated Boris Johnson. My feeling is that a lot of the decision making in Scotland was reactive. They waited to see what Johnson did and then tried to second guess what he would do next, and quite often they didn't show much fleetness of foot and ended up looking a bit ridiculous. So you've got this situation where, for example, people in Scotland can go down to a football match in Carlisle and get drunk and go to a nightclub and then come back up to Scotland the next day. How on earth is it right that if someone from Dumfries can go however many miles it is to Carlisle, 30 miles, say, and do that, but can't go into Scotland and do it? It's just utterly ludicrous. And of course, they were saying it at Christmas also that no, you should not go to another country like England. You shouldn't do that, but by all means go within Scotland. So you can drive 200 miles to Nairn or something to see your family, but for God's sake, don't go down to Blackpool. I mean, guys, come on. Well, I mean, it just struck me as tokenism in the extreme, and just let's just do something a wee bit different. Is that pretty much the way you see it?
Oh yeah, I think so. I mean, let's face it. She normally was loosening things up 2 weeks after Boris Johnson did it. Really, it was sort of the obligatory two-week wait.
Yeah.
And you do get the feeling that a lot of it. I mean, that latest clampdown with Omicron, which I think was overly cautious, and she did that too quickly, really, and it was all trying to get in ahead, and you had all this calamitous language about tsunamis of cases. But you looked into what was South Africa's experience, and I mean, you've got the doctor there who was involved with it saying, look, it's really quite mild, and calm down a bit, and clearly you've still got to take it seriously. But I think the measures, and then you decimate your economy, and clubs and restaurants and theatres and all the rest of it are all affected. So, but I don't think Nicola Sturgeon's got much of an idea about the economy, really.
No.
I don't think it's at the forefront of her thoughts, really.
Absolutely right. Indeed, I've got friends in the business community who say, to a man, there is nothing more galling to them than seeing Nicola Sturgeon standing up saying, I know how you feel. I know how much this is hurting you. No, you don't. You haven't got a clue. You've never run a business in your life. You have no idea. You've never employed anybody other than on the public purse. So they have no clue what it's like to run a business. And the treatment of Scotland's hospitality sector has been utterly, utterly appalling. And it's almost as if we're being governed by Puritans. No dancing, no football, certainly no drinking now. I mean, what? Guys, seriously, come on, you can't do this. You touched on it, mental health, and that might sound like a little bit far-fetched. It's not. People, I made this point in another podcast last week. People look forward to Christmas. It's like the pinnacle of the year. It's the big celebration, and then you've got the big family day. Then you've got the nice little quiet bit, and then you've got New Year, which is an even bigger celebration. When you go out and you light your hair down and you see in the bells, it's a new year, ringing out the old, a new start, and you have a day off. You used to have 2 days off in Scotland to recover, and then you go back chilled out. And in amongst that, you've got Boxing Day football. Boxing Day sport is enormous in Scotland. The tendencies of at football grounds, when you pay in rather than season tickets, are larger on that day than any other day. It's because every male in Scotland traditionally wants to go out and enjoy some sport on Boxing Day. You take that away, what damage are you doing to people's psyche, if you like? I mean, I firmly believe that has impacted Scotland's mental health. Would you agree, Bruce?
Oh, I think so, yeah. I mean, I think you take that away, and as you say, people look forward to it. They get out, meet their friends, and watch some sport. What could be better, really?
Absolutely
so,
right.
Yeah, it is all very puritanical. I mean, it's a joyless carry on. I mean, it's a joyless administration. I think she's a joyless person, really. But the whole thing is joyless would be the word I would use on it.
Absolutely right.
Grim, really.
Grim indeed. And you only ever hear Nicola Sturgeon laughing when she speaks in the middle of a word with this totally fake, as a way of almost dismissing what the person's asking her. Of course, I understand. Salmon used to do it as well, and that's the only time you see them smiling. Seriously, It's absolutely ridiculous. So now they just strike me as a grossly inept bunch, and I see this in terms of sustainability of businesses. And if you look at Scotland's businesses, when you damage them so badly that you deprive them of income at the key time, you don't get that back. You don't get a second chance at the Christmas holiday periods if you're in hospitality. You don't get a second chance at the peak booking season in travel and aviation, which is the sector in which I worked for a very long time. So if you blow that month, and believe it or not, the big month is January. The big month of bookings is from Boxing Day in travel. It is until about the middle or the end of February.
Yeah.
And if you're not if you can't travel, make arrangements to travel in, the damage it's done to travel companies has been awful. And people have said, obviously, this has been the worst time to be in travel. Stands to reason because nobody can travel. But there are things that you could do to offset or to mitigate that. And S&P's failed miserably to do so. And this is why it just is a litany of failure, of idiotic decisions, of really, really poor planning and appalling delivery. And that's what's summarised the S&P's reign to me. So what would your wish be for in a political sense, that is, what would you like to see happening? Maybe not for me, because the council elections are a different beast anyway, we know that. But for the next general election and for the next Holyrood election, what would Bruce Halliday like to see happening in Scotland particularly to try to stop the current quagmire, if you like?
Yeah. It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I think we are hamstrung by the three parties that are there, and they insist on standing in all the seats to get in each other's way.
Yeah.
They split the vote, and you end up with the SNP winning a seat. So I suppose what I would probably most wish for would be that these parties took a good hard look at each seat, and if they've got no chance of winning it, then stand down from it. Really.
Yep.
I think that's the only way to do it, really. Unless you end up with an amalgamated party, but that's not going to happen.
No.
So I don't know. I would hope that they would. I mean, there are obvious seats where you think Labour or Conservatives, and the Liberal Democrats, as I said before. Why are you standing there? You're not going to win it, and all you're going to achieve by standing there, you're going to let the SNP win that seat. And it happens time after time, and it's absolutely maddening. Really.
Yep.
So I'd like to see an end to that.
Absolutely right. And so say all of us, of course. Indeed. I think what will happen, my view, is that in the May elections, I don't, exactly like you say, I don't see any possibility of an amalgamated party. You won't get the Conservatives and Scottish Labour working together. Anas Sarwar would never do it. I know he's said that privately. He won't work alongside Conservatives, or he will have to be dragged kicking and screaming to do it if it ever does happen. But that being said, there won't be a party in May, I don't think. There will be somebody coming on soon who will be telling us about a party which existed, still does exist, and is looking to make big inroads. I won't spoil the surprise. I'll just wait until he comes on. So that's a possibility. There's certainly not going to be an All for Unity or an Alliance for Unity, not in this election. Maybe in subsequent elections there might be room for it, possible. I don't know. But what Bruce is saying there is, to be honest, the most basic common sense. If you have a party which is guaranteed close to 50% of the vote, but not 50% of the vote, crucially, there is no sense whatever in having three flavours of opposition parties all fighting, saying their particular brand of pro-UK sentiment to fight against this one party, which stands pretty much only on one platform, which is we want to break up the country. Yeah. And so if you have a party with as fundamental a message as that, there is no point in splitting hairs and saying, well, actually, my view of pro-UK sentiment is very different from his, so I can't possibly stand alongside him. So we'll stand against them as well as them. Oh, God, guys, no, please. So somebody's got to take a lead here. I'm looking really for the leaders of the UK parties, the leaders of, in Westminster. That's Johnson, if he's still in charge, which he probably won't be, Starmer, and what's his name? Is it Ed Davey? These are the guys who should be taking a lead here and saying to the parties in Scotland, yeah, okay, you're autonomous, but at the same time, you're still associated to us, you're affiliated with us, and you're not going to do this. It's got to stop. That's what I'd be hoping does happen. Who knows? What all we can do, all Bruce and I can do, is just keep stating what is the blindingly obvious, unfortunately, and keep putting pressure on people. And that's, I think, our role, Bruce, is just to come up with ways that we can make our voices heard and have our views stated in such a way that it pressurises the Scottish main pro-UK parties to do something differently. Because if you do it the same way you did it last time, I can guarantee what the outcome's going to be.
Yeah.
I
can see 2026 already. It's depressing me already.
Absolutely. And so, quite right, Bruce. And what I'm going to do, I mean, we fought last time, and if you like, we were kind of almost straddling two horses. We were trying to be this mechanism for, let's vote the right way. And in the same time, we're saying, oh, by the way, vote for us on the list. And a lot of people said, hang on, if you want nothing but unionists to get in, you don't want to stop any unionists to get in. And what's the point of you standing against them? To this day, people just don't understand. It was all about the arithmetic. It was because it was easier to get All for Unity candidates voted in than the main pro-UK parties. The only problem with that was there were several other small parties who took the same view, and they weren't even as successful as we are. So as we were, rather. So it didn't really work. But next time we at least we'll have our ducks in a row, and we'll know what to say to people. So I'm hopeful, and I want to finish on a positive. I'm hopeful. The fact to me, and I don't say this lightly, the fact that All for Unity attracted guys of the caliber of my guest here tonight, Bruce. I mean, that's a huge, huge, huge plus point. We also had a procurator fiscal too, in fact. Solicitors.
They were great candidates.
Absolutely,
it's such a shame that some didn't get in. They were
absolutely. I agree with that. It would have been great if George would get in, because you look at some of the stuff that's asked in Holyrood and some of the open goals that are missed by the opposition MSPs. George would have been at their throats every day, and Sturgeon would not be getting the armchair ride she is right now with Douglas Ross saying, "Well done, First Minister." And you know that. I know you're pleased about going to the rugby. Jackson Carla's been like a dog with a bone about the rugby for the last 2 weeks. I really hope things are opened up in time for the rugby. Right, Jackson, we get it. You want to go to the rugby? Great. Why didn't you show that same level of, if you like, of passion and commitment about things that don't involve your personal hobbies, though? Goodness sake. But anyway, that's it. So anyway, but that being said, I am upbeat, because I think that the people in Scotland who can see where the SNP are going wrong and can see how badly Scotland is being mismanaged, I think they will insist that their parties do the right thing. And I think what you will see is you'll see a lot of, if you like, spoiler parties in May, at least a couple saying, we don't owe you anything, main pro-UK parties. We're going to stand. You didn't do what we advised you to do last year, and you failed as a result. We're going to make it our mission to get as many of your parties' councillors ejected. And if they're replaced by us, great. If they're replaced by the SNP, so what? You didn't care about the SNP winning seats last May. Why should we care this May? I think that is what's going to happen. And that's maybe a little bit, sounds a bit bleak, but I think they'll be doing that for a reason. And that reason is to teach the main pro-UK parties a lesson. And that lesson is stop taking the votes of the Scottish unionist community for granted. And I don't like to use the term unionist, because that's nationalist framing, it's separatist framing. The pro-UK electorate will not vote forever for parties who are letting them down, as is currently happening. So that would be my message to the main pro-UK parties. Don't think that you are in any way entitled to the votes of the Scottish pro-UK electorate, because you're not. So that would be my message. So anyway, I think we're just about out of time. Bruce, can I just thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming on tonight? I know you're a busy man, and I'm really, really pleased that you came on. And did you quite like talking to the viewers?
Yeah, no, it was a pleasure, David. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for anyone who's been watching.
Great stuff, Bruce. That's terrific. Thank you indeed. So I look forward to doing more stuff with Bruce ongoing. We will ask Bruce if there are any significant developments in the health service for which we need some specialist input. And we'll ask Bruce on again in some weeks' time, and a few weeks' time. And in the meantime, it falls on me to say thank you all for listening. Thank you again to Bruce. Thank you to John and Jim for stopping out the platform.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Bruce. And guys, we shall see you again soon. Thanks very much, guys.
Okay, bye.
Bye, guys. Bye-bye.
There are any number of issues in Scotland that need addressing. Health, education, drug deaths, the economy, but all of those are taking a back seat at this conference to one issue above all else, and that's an independence referendum.
Scotland doesn't want a Boris Johnson government. It doesn't want to leave the European Union, and it wants to be able to determine its own future, whatever that future turns out to be. And this idea that the Tories can just say no and sort of imprison Scotland in a union against its will, I just don't think will hold.
Independence is what the SNP is all about, and Nicola Sturgeon is expected to reinforce that massively at this conference. There will be no chance for people who are against the First Minister's policies to get a hearing.
Just across the Irish Sea stirs a heart of loyalty, raising honor and indignity, drives a will to keep us British free. Not alone are we on this journey, for in a land just across the sea is a hand that reaches out in friendship, and a bond that's lasted centuries. And its hands cross the water, reaching out for you and me, for Queen Ulster and for Scotland, help to keep our loyal people free. Let the cry be no surrender, let no one doubt our loyalty, reaching out to the brave red hand of Ulster is the hand across the sea. Cross the water, reaching out for you and me, for Queen and Ulster and for Scotland, help to keep our loyal people free. Let the cry be no surrender, let no one doubt our loyalty, reaching out to the brave red hand of Ulster is a hand across the sea. Just across the Irish Sea stirs a heart of loyalty, raising honor and dignity, drive the will to keep us British free. Not alone, we on this journey, or in a land just across the sea. It's a hand that reaches out in friendship, is the hand across the sea, is the hand across the sea.